Three parties of travelers died on the Bozeman Trail in the November blizzard of 1887. The only person who survived did not outrun the storm, did not overpower it, and did not pray her way through it. She climbed down from her wagon, stood perfectly still in the dead air before the wind arrived, and looked at the ground directly beneath her feet. What she saw there, what she chose to do with what she saw, was the difference between her brother greeting her at his gate and weeping for her in his doorway. Her name was Sarah Halverson. She was 31 years old. She had been on the road for 6 days when the sky began to change, driving south along the most exposed stretch of the Bozeman Trail in northern Wyoming territory, bound for her brother Lars's homestead near Buffalo. The distance remaining was somewhere around 60 miles. At the pace her mule had been setting since the third day, she had reckoned on 4 more days of travel, assuming the weather held and the trail stayed merciful. The weather had held for 5 days and the trail had been almost gentle, and she understood now, looking at the sky to the northwest, that this should have been her first warning. The country did not offer mercy without interest. It always collected eventually. She was the daughter of Anders Halverson, a Norwegian shipwright who had carried his trade and his particular way of seeing the world across an ocean and settled both into the Gallatin Valley of Montana 11 winters earlier. Anders had been born on the Lofoten Islands in 1831, where the winter gales came off the Norwegian Sea with a violence that made the open Wyoming prairie look like a summer meadow. He had built boats for 3 decades. He had also built other things, and it was those other things, the huts and shelters and hard lessons pressed into his daughter on cold headlands, that would matter on this particular morning more than anything else he had ever made. What remained of Sarah's life after 6 days of paying her dead husband's debts now rode in the wagon behind her: a canvas bedroll, 2 wool blankets worn thin at the folds, a cast-iron Dutch oven that had been her mother's, a leather satchel of dried elk meat and hardtack, a water barrel lashed to the sideboards, a coil of braided hemp rope, and a wooden box of hand tools that her father had pressed into her arms as a wedding gift 4 years gone. Tools she had bought back from a creditor in Billings, with her wedding ring and the Dutch oven, and the last of her pride standing in that trading post while a stranger appraised the whole of her married life at a sum that would not have bought a decent horse. The box was the heaviest thing she owned. It was the only thing she would not have sold under any circumstances at any price to any man. Not because of what it contained, but because of what it was. The tools were not objects to her. They were her father folded into iron and wood, the man himself compressed into weight and edge and handle, and she had carried them the way a person carries the part of their history they refuse to let the country strip away. The sky to the northwest had been pale as bathwater when she broke camp at dawn. By the time the sun had climbed 2 hours into the morning, it had begun to change into something the color of an old bruise, the green-black of a wound a week into healing. She had been watching it for an hour without admitting to herself what she was watching. The change announced itself not as a darkening, but as a flattening, a strange compression of the light, as though someone had laid a sheet of hammered iron behind the sun, and the whole world had dimmed by a single even degree. She had seen that kind of light before. She had been 9 years old when she saw it, as standing on a headland in Nordland, while her father pointed at the fishing huts below and asked her what she noticed and what was missing. She had carried the answer he gave her for 22 years, through a crossing of an ocean and a marriage and a loss and 6 days of frozen road. She carried it now the way she carried the tools, without thinking about it until the moment it mattered, and then it was simply there, ready, the way a well-made thing is ready when you reach for it. The wind that had pushed steady and cold against her left cheek since she crossed the Tongue River 2 days back simply quit. It did not die down gradually. It stopped the way a held breath stops absolute and complete, and the silence that rushed in behind it raised the hair along her forearms before her mind had finished assembling the reason. The mule halted of its own accord in the middle of the track, ears swiveling forward and back, hooves planted into the frozen ground, and would not be coaxed forward by the soft clucking sound that had moved it 10,000 times before. Sarah climbed onto the wagon seat, shaded her eyes with a chapped hand, and looked north into what was coming. The bruise had spread across the entire northern sky and lifted off the horizon. It was no longer a stain at the edge of the world, but a structure, a dark, rolling wall of clouds so vast and so deliberate that it seemed less like weather than like a verdict, stretching unbroken from the eastern rim of the earth to the western one. At its base, where the black met the frozen brown of the land below, a pale gray smear hung sideways in the air like smoke laid flat, and she knew that smear for what it was. Snow already falling miles away, being driven horizontal by a wind she could not yet feel. The leading edge of a blizzard that had been building somewhere over the Bighorns while she sat on her wagon seat and allowed herself the dangerous comfort of believing the trail had decided to be gentle. She had 2 hours, perhaps less if the front was steeper than it looked. The curl at its upper edge suggested it was steeper than it looked. She was alone on an exposed ridge with no trees to break the wind, no cabin within a day's ride, no settlement, no rescue, and no second wagon coming up the trail behind her. The mule had begun to tremble in the traces in a way that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the older animal knowledge that lived beneath its hide, the knowledge that needed no language to communicate itself and was never wrong. This was the moment when Cole Briggs's voice came back to her, which was the first thing that came back to her and not the last. She had met Cole Briggs the afternoon before at the Powder River crossing, where he had stopped to water 2 teams of horses hitched to a pair of freight wagons loaded with dry goods and canvas bolts. He was 46 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the particular kind of confidence that accumulates in a man who has done a dangerous thing successfully enough times that he has stopped being able to distinguish between his skill and his luck. He had looked at her wagon the way a man looks at a thing he is about to offer a fair price for. He looked at the mule. He looked at the woman sitting alone on the seat. "You planning to get over the pass with that rig?" He said it without malice, the way a mechanic states a diagnosis. "I'll give you $12 for the mule. That's more than it's worth, and we both know it. You'll walk to Decker's station faster than that animal pulls you there." Sarah had said nothing. She had checked the split spoke on the left rear wheel, instead pressing her thumb along the grain of the cracked wood. "Storm coming," he said. "Arapaho men were reading the sky this morning. They don't get it wrong about blizzards." She had known he was right about the mule. She had known since the third day when the animal's stride shortened and it began stopping on slight upgrades that it would have taken without complaint the week before. She had not considered selling it, not because she disputed Cole Briggs's assessment of its value, but because Thomas had bought it the first spring of their marriage, when he was still the man she had married before the claiming and the dreaming and the slow hollowing out of everything they had built together. Some things a person will not sell, not because of price, but because of what selling them would mean about what is already gone. She climbed onto the wagon and drove south without answering. Cole Briggs called after, and "I'll be heading out before first light tomorrow. 2 good horses and an empty road. I'll make Deckers ahead of it." She heard the confidence in his voice and recognized it. It was the same confidence Thomas had carried into the shaft that morning, the certainty of a man who had done a thing enough times that he had confused repetition with immunity. She thought about that now, standing on the exposed ridge with the wall of cloud filling the northern sky, and she understood that Cole Briggs was almost certainly already moving two good horses at a run toward Decker's station, doing the brave and obvious thing, the thing that felt like survival, the thing her father had watched men do on the headlands of Nordland, and had specifically told her on a gray autumn afternoon when she was 9 years old, was the thing most likely to kill them. She climbed down from the wagon seat. She did not lash the mule forward. She did not scan the horizon for some impossible structure she might reach in time. She walked to the mule's head, laid both hands flat against the long bones of the animal's face, and stood perfectly still, breathing slow and even through her nose, looking not at the black wall consuming the northern sky, but at the ordinary frozen ground immediately around her feet. Her father had taught her the difference between problems you could solve and problems you could not. He had taught it to her when she was young enough to think they were the same kind of problem. He had not been gentle about the teaching, which was how he taught everything. He had been a man who believed that softness learned in calm weather became a liability in storms. The ridge ran north to south bare on both flanks. A shallow drainage fell away to the east. To the west, perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, a series of low sandstone bluffs broke the line of the land. Not dramatic formations, not anything a traveler would stop to look at, just the ordinary geological furniture of the high plains, risen and weathered and indifferent. She had passed a dozen such formations through the morning without granting any of them a second look, the way a person walks past doors in a hallway when they have no reason to open them. She fixed on those bluffs now, with the concentrated attention of someone who understood that the next 30 minutes would decide whether her brother greeted her at his gate or wept for her in his doorway. She was not looking for shelter. That distinction was everything, and it was a distinction that almost no one in her position would have thought to make. A person fleeing a storm looks for a roof, a cave, a place that feels safe. The plains were generous with places that felt safe and stingy with places that were. Sarah was not looking for safety. She was looking for walls, solid mass that wind could not move and could not pass through. The bluffs ahead were not shelter. They were potential. Raw stone waiting for someone with the eyes to read what it could become. That reframing walls instead of refuge was the inheritance her father had left her, worth more than any homestead, and it would carry her through the night that was coming. She thought of him then, unbidden, the way the dead arrive when you most need them and least expect them. Anders Halverson had stood her on that Nordland headland the autumn she turned 9, and pointed down at the fishing huts clinging to the cliff faces below. Small dark shapes pressed into the stone, half swallowed by it. He asked what she noticed about them. She had said they were small. He agreed. She said they were tucked back into the rock. He agreed again. Then he asked what was missing. She had looked and finally seen the absence he meant. There was no chimney, no stovepipe, no glow of lamp or fire in any of them. Just walls and a roof, 4 sides, and a lid fastened to the cliff face like barnacles fixed to the hull of a boat. And inside those heatless boxes, men slept through gales that turned the sea white and kept sleeping until morning. What her father told her then, she had carried for 22 years, and she heard his voice carry it again now across the dead prairie, with the storm building behind it, his hand heavy and certain on her small shoulder. The killer was the wind, not the cold. That was the first thing, and it was the thing almost no one understood until it was too late to use the understanding. A human body at rest in still air, even bitter air well below freezing, sheds its heat slowly enough to survive for hours. The body is a furnace that never stops burning, and in still air the warmth it makes gathers in a thin, invisible layer against the skin and holds there a fragile boundary between the living and the dead. But wind tears that boundary away faster than the body can rebuild it, scrapes it off, and flings it into the void. The colder and harder the wind blows, the faster the theft until the body is losing heat at 4 or 5 times the rate it can make it, and no amount of shivering can close that gap. A blizzard on the open plains did not kill by freezing. It killed by robbery, and the dying at the end did the most reasonable thing in the world, which was to sit down in the snow because standing had become so very hard, and they did not stand again. Anders had told her this so plainly that she had nearly missed how much it mattered. The answer was not warmth. You could not carry enough warmth onto an open plain to survive a blizzard. The answer was walls. Every wall you placed between your body and the wind was a wall the wind could not use to rob you. And the wall did not need to be strong, and it did not need to be beautiful, and it did not need to outlast the night. It needed only one thing. It needed to be whole. She came back to herself with her hands still resting on the mule's face and the bluffs still standing in the middle distance waiting for her. She knew now exactly what she was hunting among them. Not a cave which the plains would never give her, not even a comfortable hollow. 3 walls of stone she could not have moved with a team of oxen, walls the storm would break against instead of breaking through arranged so that whatever opening remained could be closed by hand in the little time she had. She unhitched the mule from the traces with cold stiffened fingers, looped the lead rope over her wrist, and led the trembling animal forward at a walk toward the sandstone, leaving the wagon standing alone on the open ridge. She passed the first formation without slowing. The hollow in its eastern face was barely deep enough to seat a single hunched body. She passed the second, scanning its face, finding nothing that would serve. The wind remained absent. The air was still as hell breath, and that stillness frightened her more than any gust could have, because she knew what sudden stillness meant. She had learned it as a girl watching storms come off the Norwegian Sea. It meant the air was being hauled away to somewhere else, gathered up by a column of pressure, rising beyond the curve of the earth, collecting force the way a fist collects force before it opens. The third formation was different in a way her eye caught before her mind named it. The hollow in its eastern face was wider than the others, perhaps 18 feet across the mouth, and instead of a shallow scoop, it curved inward at the tip and along both sides an alcove that ran back 6 feet into the rock at its deepest reach. The floor was dry sand and flat stone, sheltered from rain and snow by the overhang above. 3 walls stood around it left and right and behind, solid and unbroken and older than any nation that had ever claimed the land above them. The open mouth faced east, away from the northwest wind that was bearing down. It was not a cave. It was not remotely a cave. But Sarah looked into it, and her chest loosened for the first time since the wind had died, because she did not see a hollow in the rock. She saw 3 walls already standing, raised and finished long before her father was born. She tied the mule to a stunted juniper, rooted in a crack in the sandstone, a tree no taller than herself, bent permanently eastward by the prevailing wind, a living record of which direction the killing came from. She spoke to the animal once, a single low word in her father's Norwegian, the word he had used to settle nervous draft horses on the docks in Billings, a word that meant, "Be still," that the mule could not have understood, except that the tone of it had been pressed into the species across 10,000 years of frightened people needing frightened animals to hold. Then she noticed it. In the far corner of the hollow, half buried in the dry sand of the floor, lay a horseshoe, old iron gone entirely to rust, the nail holes long since widened by weather. Someone had been here before her. She could not know whether they had found the same 3 walls and understood them the way she did, or whether they had simply sheltered their horse for a night and moved on. She could not know whether they had lived or died. She pressed her palm flat against the cold iron for 1 second, feeling the weight of whoever had stood in this same hollow with the same problem, and then she set it aside and turned to face what still needed doing. The earth had done the heavy labor. The stone had been carved by patient weather into very nearly the exact shape her survival required. What remained was the part the earth could not do for her, the fourth wall, the closing of every seam, and the only material on the whole exposed ridge that might serve as that fourth wall was sitting 400 yards behind her on the open trail. She turned and ran back toward the wagon boots, breaking through the brittle crust of frost into the dead grass beneath, breath sawing in her throat, the dark wall of the sky pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. The wagon stood where she had left it, patient and already doomed. The light had shifted in the minute she had been gone. The flat iron gray had taken on a sickly yellow undertone that smeared the whole prairie in the color of illness, and she had seen that exact light once before on a Nordland afternoon, in the moments before a storm that took 14 men off the water and gave back none of them. She did not let herself count the remaining time. Counting was for moments when the count could change the decision, and her decision was already made. She opened the wooden box of her father's tools and took out the small hatchet. The blade was still sharp. Anders had mailed it every autumn for 30 years without missing once. She tucked it into her belt and looked at the wagon for what she understood might be the last time she would see it whole. Thomas had mortgaged it. She had bought it back. It had carried her 6 days through frozen country after everything else was gone. She did not think of it as a wagon anymore. She had stopped thinking of it as a wagon the moment her father's lesson arrived in her mind, the way it always arrived, quietly and without announcement, like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. She thought of it as the fourth side of her shelter, the lid for a box the earth had already built. She went to work. The front axle came apart on the third blow of the hatchet against the kingpin, the iron dropping to the frozen ground with a crack that the dead still air carried much farther than it should have. She crawled beneath the wagon bed and worked the rear axle free, the same way, shoulders jammed against the underside of the planking, the cold of the ground soaking through her coat and into her spine. When the running gear finally separated, the wooden bed settled flat onto the prairie, a heavy open-topped box that weighed close to 300 pounds. She knelt beside it for a moment, breathing hard, and made the calculation her father had drilled into her. Not, can I carry this, but how does the land let me move it? The ground between the wagon and the bluff fell away in a gentle, unbroken downhill grade. That grade was a tool. She had 60 feet of her father's good hemp rope, but 300 pounds of dead weight dragged whole across frozen grass would beat her before she covered half the distance, and she knew it, so she did not try on. She knocked the split sideboard free and the sagging tailgate as well, shedding 40 pounds of the most useless wood. She pried up two of the heaviest floor planks and set them aside to carry separately, lightening the box until it was a thing the slope in the rope and her own failing strength might together manage to move. The dismantling cost her minutes she did not have, and she spent them anyway because a wall she could not move into place was no better than no wall, and her father had not raised a daughter who confused effort with progress. She ran the rope through the front stake pockets of the lightened bed and twisted it into a crude harness across her shoulders and chest, the way she had watched her father rig a sledge. She set her boots against the downhill pitch and leaned into it until the hemp bit into her collarbones. The box did not move. She leaned harder, dropping her weight forward until her face nearly touched the frozen grass, and with a long, tearing groan, the bed broke free of the frost that had begun to grip it and slid grudgingly a foot, then two, then into a slow, scraping crawl down the grade. She moved it in 2 stages because her body gave her no choice, hauling until her vision went gray at the edges and the rope felt like it was sawing through to the bone, then stopping to stand bent over with her hands on her knees and drag air that was beginning to bite at the back of her throat before bending again to the harness. Her palms split open against the rough hemp. The pain in her shoulders climbed her neck and forked down her spine and became a single hot wire of agony that she stopped feeling as separate from the work, because the work was everything now and the pain was only its language. Twice she fell to her knees when the box snagged on a buried stone, and twice she stood up because the alternative to standing up was a thing she had already watched carried off a Norwegian beach. When she dragged the wagon bed the final yards into the mouth of the hollow, the sky had finished closing. The yellow had deepened to a brown-black dust, though it was scarcely past midday, and the curling wave of cloud was directly overhead, now beginning to spill its leading snow in fine dry grains that hissed against the sandstone and stung her cheeks like flung sand. She had no time to rest the body that had done the work. She wrestled the bed into position across the center of the 18-foot opening, sideboards turned outward to face the wind, and even in her exhausted and shaking state, she saw the problem immediately. The same problem her father would have seen and named without hesitation. The bed was 10 feet long. The opening was 18. She had walled the center and left 4 feet of open mouth at either end. 4 feet of opening to a wind that would hunt through it all night was the same as leaving the door thrown wide. Those gaps were the whole danger, now the channels through which the storm would bypass everything she had bled to build and fill the hollow with moving, stealing air. She attacked them with the last of her strength and the first principle her father had given her, which was that completeness admitted no exceptions and no negotiations. She fetched the torn canvas from the abandoned running gear and stretched it across the upper opening between the top of the sideboards and the overhanging rock weighting its top edge, with stones along the lip of the overhang, lashing its bottom to the sideboard stakes with rope cut short from the coil. The canvas did not lie flat. It billowed and gaped where the fabric had torn. But it covered most of the upper void, and what it failed to cover she would close by other means, because there was always another means, and her father had taught her every one of them. She tore armfuls of dead grass from the slope below the bluff, knee-high and brittle and dry as old paper, and she packed it into every seam between the wagon bed and the stone walls on either flank. The 4-foot gaps at the ends she filled first and most fiercely, stuffing the grass deep into the crevices, where rock met wood, ramming it home with the heel of her hand, and then with a flat stone used as a tamper, pressing and pressing until no thread of bruised daylight showed through. Where the canvas gaped at the top, she hung the first of her 2 wool blankets, pinning its corners with stones wedged hard into cracks in the overhang. Where the uneven floor left gaps beneath the lower edge of the bed, she scraped loose sand from the hollow's floor and packed it against the wood like a mason troweling mortar, building it up and pressing it flat, sealing the box to the earth. Then she brought the mule inside. She brought it inside not because she felt affection for the animal in that moment, though she did, but because she had worked out an arithmetic before her hands ever touched the grass. A mule at rest generates heat. In a sealed space of roughly 300 cubic feet, that heat was not a comfort. It was a strategy. The difference between freezing and surviving a long cold night could come down to a few degrees, and a living animal pressed against her was a few degrees she did not have to manufacture from a fire she could not build. She let it in through a gap left at one end of the bed, ducked its head beneath the overhang, drew it sideways through the narrow throat of space between rock and wood, and then sealed that final gap behind it with the second blanket and more grass tamped tight, working by feel alone in the thickening dark. Her fingers too cold to report what they were touching, but still capable of movement, still capable of the slow, careful work of closing. The mule stood with its head hung low against the back wall of the hollow flanks, heaving breath pluming in the deepening dark, and it pressed its body to the stone as though it understood what the rock was for. Perhaps in the old, wordless way of animals it did. Sarah lowered herself against the back wall, drew the leather satchel onto her lap, and let the burning in her shoulders settle into a deep, dull ache that meant the labor was finished. There was nothing left to do, and the nothing terrified her more than the work had, because while she worked, she had been the thing acting upon the world. Now she would be the thing acted upon. She had built what could be built from a wrecked wagon and a hole in the rock and a girl's memory of her father's voice. She had sealed what could be sealed. The wall was not strong and it was not fair to look upon, and it would not outlast the spring thaw. But it was whole, and whole was the only word that had ever mattered. She pressed her raw and bleeding palms flat against the cold sand of the floor, felt the faint living warmth of the mule along her left side, and waited for the wind to come and tell her whether she had built a shelter or a grave. It came at 2:30 by her reckoning of the light that no longer existed, and she did not see it arrive because there was nothing left to see through, but she heard it, and the hearing of it was a thing she would carry to the end of her days. It began as a low, continuous hum, almost gentle, almost like the sound a telegraph wire makes in a light wind, a tone rather than a noise, felt as much as heard through the sandstone at her back. She had 3 seconds of that gentleness. Then it became something else entirely. The roar did not build from one direction. It arrived from every direction at once, a sound with physical mass, a howl that pressed against the canvas and the packed grass and the wool blanket like something solid, like water behind a dam that has found the seam it has been looking for. The sandstone around her shuddered. She felt it through her spine where her back touched the rear wall, felt it in her molars, felt it in the bones of her hands pressed flat against the cold sand. A grinding that came from deep in the earth, not from the storm, but from the stone itself, the ancient rock absorbing the blow of a wind that had crossed 500 miles of open plain without finding a single thing tall enough to slow it down. The canvas snapped taut and screamed against its ties. She had expected the noise. She had not expected the intelligence of it. That was the word that came to her in those first minutes, crouched in the dark, with her knees drawn to her chest, and her father's lesson held in her rib cage like the last coal of a fire. The wind did not simply push, it probed. It rose to a shriek along the left flank of the wagon bed, testing the junction between wood and stone, then dropped abruptly to a low circling moan, before climbing again from a completely different angle, as though it had abandoned one approach and moved to study another. It worked through the compass points without pattern or rhythm, and the absence of rhythm was the cruelest part, because there was nothing to brace against, no predictable peak after which she could exhale. The mule stamped behind her in the dark. She heard its iron shoes strike sparks off the stone floor that she could not see, brief phantom flickers that existed and disappeared before her eyes could confirm them. The animal's breath came fast and shallow, punctuated by small sounds in its throat that were not quite whinnies, not quite silence, the vocal equivalent of controlled panic from a creature that had no way to run and had not yet decided whether that was a mercy or a sentence. Sarah counted her own breaths. It was the only act of will the storm left her. In for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, a rhythm she imposed on herself, because the wind had stripped every other rhythm from the world, and she needed one to hold on to. 40 minutes into the storm, the upper left corner of the canvas tore free. She heard the knot give before she heard the fabric rip, a single sharp pop that cut through the roar, the way a pistol shot cuts through a crowd. The freed edge whipped inward and slapped the darkness above her head, and through the gap that opened, the blizzard poured itself into the hollow in a single concentrated jet. Snow driving in horizontal, fine as flour and hard as ground glass against the skin of her face. And behind the snow, a column of killing air that dropped the temperature inside the space by several degrees in the time it took her to recognize what had happened. She was moving before the recognition was complete. Across the sand on her hands and knees, blind in the absolute dark, navigating entirely by the memory she had made when she built the wall. The memory of where each stake was, where each knot sat, how the rope ran through the sideboard pocket at this particular end. Her fingers were past feeling. They reported nothing about texture or temperature, only the blunt fact of contact, only pressure and resistance. And she worked through that numbness the way a carpenter works through noise, filtering it out, finding the information underneath. She found the rope by the change in tension when her palm closed around it. She fed the slack end back through the stake pocket, by sense of angle alone pulled it tight against the canvases with a strength she did not believe she still possessed, and cinched it with two half hitches that she tied by the shape of the motion rather than by sight or feeling. When the canvas sealed back against the overhang and the jet of freezing air thinned and stopped, she sank back onto her heels and stayed there for a long moment, shaking. She understood something then that she had not fully understood before she built the wall. The storm needed to win only once. She needed to win every time. 30 minutes later, the canvas tore again. The same corner, that not defeated by the same patient assault from a wind that did not experience fatigue. She crawled forward through the dark again, found the rope again, tied it again, returned to the back wall again. The second time was harder than the first because the cold inside the hollow had deepened during the breach, and her hands, which had been merely numb before, were now approaching the threshold where numb becomes something worse. It was during the return from the second repair, crawling back across the sand with grit pressing into her bleeding palms, that the mule made its move. A gust struck the bluff with a concussion she felt in her teeth, a sound like a heavy door slamming in a cathedral, and the animal lunged sideways in pure atavistic panic, all 800 pounds of it driving into the wagon bed, with enough force to shift the entire structure several inches across its bed of packed sand. For one suspended moment, Sarah was certain the wall would fail, that the box would continue moving, that the seal would crack open, and the storm would find what it had been hunting for since it arrived. The wagon bed held. It jammed against an irregularity in the stone floor and stopped. The mule, finding nowhere to flee in the space she had deliberately built too small for flight, subsided slowly into trembling stillness against the rear wall. She could hear its breathing from across the hollow, ragged, and too fast, the breathing of an animal that had used up its first response and had not yet found its second. She had not built the shelter small by accident. A bolting mule on the open ridge in a full Wyoming blizzard was a dead mule within the hour, and a dead mule was warmth she could not spare. She had calculated the dimensions of the hollow's usable space against the mule's body length before she brought it inside, making the enclosure tight enough that panic had nowhere to take itself. It was a cold arithmetic, and she did not apologize for it even to herself. She spoke to the animal from across the darkness, not words it could understand, just sound, her voice low and continuous and level. The same tone her father had used with horses on the Billings docks when a ship came in too fast and the animals on the wharf began to crowd and stamp. The tone that said, "I am here and I am not afraid," which was a lie but a useful one, the kind of lie that serves both the one who tells it and the one who needs to believe it. The mule's breathing slowed degree by degree over the next 10 minutes. Then the storm did something she had not planned for and could not have planned for, and it did it, as her father might have said, not out of kindness, but out of the same indifference with which it did everything else. The moisture still trapped in the packed grass along the flanks of the wagon bed froze. She noticed it first as an absence. The thin whistle of air that had been threading through the seam she had packed least carefully in her hurry, dropped in pitch and then stopped. She raised her right hand toward the place where she had felt the worst intrusion of moving air, bracing herself for the needle cold of a gap still open, and found instead a surface that did not yield to her fingers, a hard ridge of material that had been loose stalks an hour ago and was now a fused mass grass fibers bound together by ice into something closer to stone than to plant. The blizzard had done what her hands had been too cold and too rushed to do properly. Every bit of moisture the grass had retained was now locked into place, crystallized through the tangled fibers binding each stalk to the next, until the entire packed length of each seam had become a single sealed unit. The gaps she had been afraid were too irregular to ever truly close, had been closed by the storm itself, filled by the same wind-driven snow that had been trying to kill her, plastered into every remaining void and frozen there. A sound came out of her in the dark. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry. It was the sound of a person who has understood something important in a place and at a moment when understanding feels almost like grace. The blizzard had come to destroy the wall she built. Instead, it was finishing it. She sat with that for a long time in the dark, listening to the roar that had become a drone, that had become a deep, continuous pressure she felt more than heard. The snow was piling against the outside of the wagon bed, she understood, rising up the sideboards, packing against the grass-stuffed flanks building, layer upon layer, each layer a degree of insulation she could never have carried there herself. The very force that had been trying to strip the warmth from her body was now wrapping her shelter in a blanket made of its own ammunition. Her father had taught her the principle of the wall. He had never said aloud what she understood now, sitting buried in the dark, because perhaps he had never needed to say it. You did not fight the storm. You shaped yourself so precisely, so completely, that the storm's own violence had nothing to work against and began without meaning to work for you instead. But with the immediate crisis of the breaches behind her and the seams sealed by forces she had not controlled, the noise outside became a presence rather than an emergency. And in the silence that opened inside her when the emergency passed, something else arrived that she had been out running for 9 weeks and 6 days on the trail. It arrived the way grief always arrives when it has been kept waiting long enough. Not as a wave, not with warning, simply as a presence occupying the space that terror had vacated. Thomas. Thomas Reed had been dead for 9 weeks. She had not allowed herself to stop moving long enough to feel it, because feeling it required sitting still, and sitting still on the trail was a way of dying. And she had refused dying with the same stubbornness she had refused selling her father's tools. She had wrapped the grief in the work of surviving and carried it that way, the way you carry a wound that is too serious to tend in the field. You keep moving. You tend it later. Later had found her. She had told the trader in Billings, when she signed away the last of what she and Thomas had owned together, that her husband had died in a mining accident, a cave-in at the silver claim. And that was true the way a half is true, the way a map is true when it shows only the road and leaves out the condition of the road. What it left out was the morning of the collapse. What it left out was that she had stood at the mouth of the shaft and looked at the support timbers. Her father's hands lived in her hands and told her everything she needed to know. Green wood cut too young, the grain still wet and alive, driven into ground that the shaft had compromised by going 20 feet deeper than the rock would honestly bear. She had told Thomas. She had told him plainly in the language her father had given her, the language of load and angle and the patient weight of the earth. She had told him the timbers would not hold. Thomas had smiled at her, that smile, the one she had loved first and learned to dread later, the smile of a man whose certainty was so complete that it had grown a membrane around itself, a surface that deflected information the way oilcloth deflects rain. We're a week from paying out, he had told her, his eyes already down the shaft, already counting silver that existed only in the arithmetic of his wanting. I can't stop now, not when we're this close to everything I promised you. She had not gone down with him. She trusted her father's eyes, which lived in her hands, which had touched the timbers and known. She walked back up to the cabin and began the day's work. She was hanging wash on the line when the sound came up. The mountain felt in her feet before it reached her ears. She had run. She ran until her lungs tore and her legs stopped making sense beneath her, and she reached the shaft mouth and found a column of pale dust rising slowly from a place where an entrance had been. She screamed his name into that dust until she had no voice left. And in the middle of that screaming, in the gap between one breath and the next, a voice that was hers and not hers whispered a thing she had never permitted herself to examine directly. It said, "I told him so." That whisper, that small, traitorous, entirely accurate whisper. That was what she had been carrying on the trail beneath the hardtack and the rope and the Dutch oven and the tools. That was the cargo that had no weight you could measure but pressed down harder than all the rest. She wept in the sealed dark for the first time since the dust rose off the mountain. She pressed her face against her drawn-up knees and let it come without fighting it, without performing anything for anyone, because there was no one to perform for. Only the stone and the animal and the dark and the storm outside doing its work. She wept for Thomas, for the man she had married in the Gallatin Valley when she was 27 and he was 30, and the world felt like a thing that could be shaped by wanting it hard enough. She wept for the girl she had been, then the girl who had mistaken his certainty for strength and his dreaming for vision and his refusal to hear warnings for a kind of courage rather than a kind of blindness. She wept for the years, the good homestead that became a mortgaged one, the first claim, the second, the green timbers of the third, the slow withdrawal of whatever warmth had passed between them as she watched the dreaming eat everything they had built. And she wept finally and most honestly for the whisper itself. Not because it was wrong, it had not been wrong, she had told him so, and the mountain had agreed with her in the most absolute terms available to it. But being right had not helped him. Being right had not saved him. And being right while he died had left her with a guilt that had no clean name in any language she knew. A guilt not of action, but of accuracy. The guilt of having been the one who saw the thing clearly, while the person she was supposed to love did not. She let the weeping run its course the way her father had taught her to let a squall run its course, neither fighting it nor surrendering to it entirely, waiting it out with the knowledge that all weather, inner and outer, eventually passed. When it passed, she found the hollow felt different, not warmer in temperature, warmer in some other register she had no precise word for, as though the grief had been its own kind of cold, the kind that seeps in through gaps in the wall you did not think to seal, and she had finally, at the bottom of a Wyoming night, with a blizzard raging above her, found those gaps and closed them. She ate then, because the body that wept was the same body that would freeze if she let its reserves burn out, and the mathematics of survival did not pause for grief. She chewed a square of hardtack in the dark, slowly making herself feel each swallow. She drank a careful mouthful from the canteen she had kept inside her coat since she first saw the sky change so the water would not freeze. Her father had told her once, watching a neighbor waste away after losing his wife, that a man who stopped eating because he was Zen had decided to follow her whether he admitted the choice or not. Sarah had not decided to follow Thomas. She chewed the hardtack as proof. She became aware sometime in the hours after that the quality of the sound had shifted again. The howl had flattened into a drone. The sharp percussive gusts had blurred into a single sustained pressure. And she understood from the evenness of it, that the snow had built up high enough on the outside of her shelter that the wind was no longer striking the wagon bed directly, but passing over the top of the accumulated drift, the way water passes over a submerged stone. She was buried. The realization arrived with two meanings simultaneously. The first was relief her wall had held long enough for the storm to bury it, which meant the seams were sealed, and the temperature inside would drop slowly by patient degrees rather than being torn away in sudden murderous gusts. The second meaning was darker. A shelter buried deep enough might not be possible to exit. She did not know how deep the snow would go before the wind exhausted itself. She noted that possibility and set it aside because she could not do anything about it in the dark and the cold with a blizzard still moving above her. Her father had taught her to identify the problems she could solve and leave the ones she could not solve alone until the conditions changed. The snow's depth was a problem that would resolve itself at dawn one way or another. The cold was a problem she could address now. The numbness had moved up past her ankles. She drew her knees tighter, worked her feet inside her boots in steady rotations, pressed her left side harder against the mule's flank. The animal had settled into a deep stillness, its breathing slow and regular now, and the warmth it generated passed through her coat and into her ribs with the steady reliability of something built to last. She had brought it inside for the arithmetic. She found herself grateful for it in a way that had nothing to do with arithmetic. She made herself a promise in the dark, the kind of promise that is really a command. She would not sleep. She knew the danger precisely. The feeling that came when the body's core began its slide downward felt exactly like ordinary tiredness. It felt like rest that was deserved. The men who sat down in the snow on the open plain in the final minutes believed in those minutes that they were only taking a brief rest. She would not mistake the one for the other. She fought the sleep with the tools she had. She recited in her mind the names of every boat her father had built, the long Norwegian names she had memorized as a girl perched on his workbench, watching him plane and join the hull planks. She enumerated in her mind the chores she would perform at Lars's homestead to earn her keep, specific and practical, the kind of thinking that kept the mind in the present tense. She pinched the soft skin on the inside of her forearm, hard enough to raise a welt, a small bright pain that was a tether back to wakefulness each time her eyes began to close. For 3 hours she fought it. Her body had dragged 300 pounds of wagon across 400 yards of frozen ground. It had torn grass and packed seams and fought a tearing canvas with bleeding hands. It had wept itself empty in the dark. And there came a point past the third hour, a point she could not identify until it was already behind her, past which the will that had built the wall and sealed the seams and repaired the breaches simply did not have enough left to keep the eyes open. Sarah Halverson slid down into sleep against the warm flank of the mule and did not feel herself go. That she woke at all was the night's second mercy, and it was a mercy purchased by the same cold arithmetic she had applied to every problem since the wind died on the ridge. The mule's warmth, steady and undiminishing, had held the temperature of the sealed and snow-blanketed hollow above the threshold that would have finished her unconscious body's slow slide toward cold that does not release. She had built the furnace into the wall before she knew she would need it, for exactly this had brought the animal inside against a cold she could calculate, not against the sleep she had sworn she would not take. She woke into a darkness so complete she could not determine whether her eyes were open. For one suspended moment of total animal disorientation, she did not know if she was alive. She did not know if the dark was the dark of the hollow or the dark behind closed eyes, or a dark that meant the cold had finished its work while she slept, and there was simply no more light in her world. Then she felt the mule breathing beside her. She felt the great, slow expansion of its ribs against her shoulder. She felt the heat of it soaked into her own body, not the shocking heat of fire, but the patient heat of a living thing that had simply kept generating warmth hour after hour without ceasing, indifferent to the storm and indifferent to her fear and indifferent to everything except the slow, reliable business of being alive. The terror released its grip on her throat. She was alive. She was cold bitterly and thoroughly cold. Her feet two distant, aching objects at the ends of her legs, but she was alive, and the hollow around her was silent in a way it had not been when she lost consciousness. The deep drone of the buried storm had faded to something she had to hold her own breath to hear, a far-off murmur at the edge of perception. She reached out in the absolute dark and laid her palm against the wagon bed. Cold but dry. No snow had breached it while she slept. She reached up and touched the canvas overhead. Her hand met something rigid, frozen solid, sheathed in ice, and packed snow on its outer face. What had been a billowing, gaping, doubtful scrap of wagon cover when she tied it into place 12 hours ago now felt as solid to the touch as the stone walls themselves. She had built without intending to, and without being able to, a structure that was stronger in the morning than it had been at dusk. The storm, in the full measure of its violence, had welded her improvised pieces into a single sealed shell, and she lay in the dark with her hand against that frozen ceiling and understood the final weight of what her father had spent a lifetime trying to teach. The wall did not have to begin strong. It only had to begin whole. A whole thing, even a poor and patched and salvaged whole thing, gathered strength from the very forces sent to destroy it, while a strong thing with a single gap gave everything away through the opening. She had heard those words at 9 years old on a headland above the Norwegian Sea. She understood them now, at 31, buried under a Wyoming blizzard with a mule's steady warmth keeping her heart going, and the understanding was worth every cold mile that had carried her to it. Along the top edge of the frozen canvas where the ice-sheathed fabric met the sandstone overhang, a thread of gray had appeared. Not light exactly, not yet, but the suggestion of light, the faintest possible intimation of a world that still existed beyond the shell she had sealed herself into. She stared at it without breathing. It brightened. Slowly, by the smallest imaginable degrees, it brightened. Dawn, or something close enough to dawn that the difference no longer mattered. She did not move toward it. She did not weep at the sight of it. She lay on the cold sand and watched it the way a sailor watches a star he is using to navigate with a fixed and unsentimental attention, because she understood that the light appearing did not mean she was saved. It meant only that the storm had passed over her and gone, and that now there remained the matter of getting out of a tomb she had built with her own hands into a world the blizzard had remade entirely while she lay beneath it. She reached out in the dark and found the hatchet where she had set it within reach, the one tool she had thought to keep close, the one tool that was her father's hands in iron and wood sharp and ready. She would need it. The wall that had kept her alive had also sealed her in, and the only way forward was through the very completeness that had saved her. She worked in the dark by touch and memory, the hatchet making short, careful strokes against the frozen seal at the end of the wagon bed, where she had packed the last grass and hung the second blanket and closed the mule inside with her 12 hours before. What her hands had made in desperation the afternoon before had been transformed by the night into something she had to unmake with iron. The frozen grass did not crumble. It fractured in chunks dense as compressed earth, and she worked each piece loose and set it aside rather than letting it fall outward because she did not know yet how deep the drift ran beyond the wall, and she was not ready to open the hollow to whatever lay outside until she had enough of a hole to see through. The mule sensed the work before it understood what the work meant. She felt the shift in its breathing at her back, the quickening that moved through its body as the smell of outside air began threading through the widening gap. Cold, clean, absolutely scoured of every particle of scent the storm had not driven away. She paused with her face near the opening and breathed it in, and the contrast with the closed, warm musk of the hollow behind her was so complete it was almost violent, two entirely different versions of air divided by 6 inches of frozen grass and ice. She had thought during the long, buried hours about what she would find when she got out. She had thought about it with the disciplined restraint of a person who has learned that imagining a destination too clearly is a way of betting on it, and she had stopped betting on outcomes the day the dust rose off the mountain in a pale column and gave her back nothing but silence where Thomas's name had been. She had allowed herself only the next step, then the nut and nothing beyond. Now the next step was this hole, and she widened it with the same methodical care she had brought to everything since the moment she climbed down from the wagon seat and refused to run. When the gap was large enough to see through, she stopped. The world beyond the hollow was not the world she had entered from. The ridge where she had stood and watched the northern sky consume itself, the shallow drainage to the east, the scattered scrub and frozen grass and bare dirt of the high plains in November, all of it was gone. In its place was a single unbroken surface of white that ran from the base of the bluff outward to a horizon she could not distinguish from the sky above it. The snow lay sculpted into long, low forms, wave-like but frozen in mid-motion, a sea that had been stopped at the precise moment of its own movement and locked into that position by the cold that followed the storm. No trail, no landmark, no feature of any kind that corresponded to the ground she had crossed the day before. The drift against the wagon bed had risen to within an inch of the upper rail of the sideboard. Only the very top edge of the weathered wood showed above the white surface. She understood what she was looking at. The storm had not only passed over her, it had erased the country she had been navigating through, replaced it with something new and featureless and indifferent to the route she had been following, and the 60 miles between her and Lars's homestead had just become 60 miles with no trail to follow and no landmark to steer by, and a sun she would have to read like a text in a language she had learned as a child and not used in 20 years. She felt the fear of it register in her body, and then she felt it settle the way something dense settles when you stop trying to hold it up. Not disappear. Settle. The night in the hollow had done something to the calibration of what frightened her. The prospect of a long walk through featureless white registered now not as terror, but as work, the next wall to build, the next problem to solve with whatever she had in her hands. She had survived the thing that was supposed to kill her. Everything after that was simply what came next. She widened the gap until it was large enough for the mule working the edges with the hatchet and her hands scooping broken frozen grass back into the hollow behind her so the drift outside did not collapse inward. The mule, which had been pressing forward against her with increasing urgency for the last 20 minutes, a low, insistent sound in its throat finally drove its head through the opening when the gap was barely wide enough, and she had to brace herself against the wagon bed with both hands and lean her full weight against its neck to slow it down. "Easy," she said. The word came out of her cracked lips in a voice she barely recognized, unused through the long night except for the low sounds she had made to settle the animal during the worst of the storm. Easy. We did not come this far to die in the doorway. She had not planned those words. They arrived already formed, and she understood as she spoke them that they were not directed only at the mule, had perhaps never been directed at the mule at all. They were directed at the part of herself that wanted to lunge through the gap before it was ready to rush the last careful work and undo everything in a moment of impatience, because it had been a very long night and the light outside was real, and her legs wanted badly to carry her toward it at whatever speed she could manage. She held the mule back until the gap was genuinely ready. Then she guided it through one careful step at a time, and it broke out into the open with a great surging heave and stood in the snow with its legs spread for balance and its head up and its breath rising off its body in columns of vapor that hung motionless in the windless air, rising straight up without dispersing, without drifting, standing in the stillness like monuments to the fact that the storm was over and the animal had outlasted it. Sarah climbed out after the mule. She stood upright for the first time in 19 hours, her body registering the movement with a cascading inventory of complaints from every system that had been held still too long, and she turned to look at what she had built. From the outside, in the flat gray light of the Wyoming morning, after the shelter that had kept her alive was nearly invisible. The wagon bed was buried to its top rail. The canvas above it had frozen into a seamless continuation of the bluff's snow-covered face, indistinguishable from the natural accumulation against the stone. The grass-packed flanks had disappeared entirely under compacted drift. There was no seam visible, no evidence of human construction. Nothing to indicate that what appeared to be an ordinary depression in the snow at the base of an ordinary sandstone formation was anything other than what the land had made of its own materials over its own time. A rider passing within 50 feet would have seen nothing. She stood in the great silence and looked at her own invisible work at the wrecked wagon bed, dragged into a hole in the rock and sealed with dead grass and torn canvas and packed dirt in the pure force of necessity. Half the materials broken before she ever touched them. None of it designed or fitted or chosen. All of it whole. What rose in her chest was not pride. Pride was too loud, too self-regarding for what she felt. It was something quieter and more durable, the deep satisfaction of a thing done correctly under conditions that did not allow for correction. It had held not because it was strong, but because it was sealed, because she had refused the wind, the single opening it had hunted for through 19 hours, and the wholeness had been enough, exactly as her father had promised it would be, on a headland above the Norwegian Sea 22 years before. The cold was working at her even in its stillness. She turned her face up to the pale disk of the sun, just visible now through the thinning overcast low in the southeast, and she fixed its position with the same focused attention her father had taught her to give a navigational star. Then she began the cold, practical work of converting a smear of light behind cloud into a heading she could hold when the ground itself had become a featureless, white expanse with no trail and no marker, and no honest indication of which direction led to anything that could keep her alive for another night. She set off with the mule on a lead rope behind her, choosing to walk rather than ride. The movement would keep blood in her feet. The mule could carry the satchel and the Dutch oven without carrying her weight through drifts that might reach her thighs in the low places. She had 4 days of food remaining if she rationed it carefully. She had a hatchet and 60 miles of open country and a sun she could read well enough on clear days to hold a heading south. The first hour taught her the true nature of the problem. The snow had not yet settled into a crust that would bear weight. In the places where the wind had piled it deep, she sank to her knee with every step, a slow, lurching rhythm of plunge and recovery that used energy she needed to conserve. In the places where the wind had scoured the ground, nearly bare the frozen earth beneath was slick and unpredictable. She could not see which was which until her foot found it, so she walked in a constant state of minor crisis, each stride a small, separate negotiation with the ground. She made 8 miles that first day and paid for every one of them. When the light began to fail, she stopped. While she still had enough strength to make camp because her father had told her that the last mistake a man makes in hard country is pushing past his reserves in the belief that the next mile will bring him somewhere better. The next mile almost never brought anyone somewhere better. What it brought was exhaustion at the moment when exhaustion was most dangerous. She found a low-cut bank where a frozen creek had carved a shelf into its southern face, and she dug into the snow at its base with the hatchet, hollowing a pocket large enough for herself and the mule, packing the excavated snow into a low wall across the open side. Smaller than the hollow, cruder than the hollow, no wagon bed, no canvas, no grass within reach. But she had the principle, and the principle did not require any particular set of materials. It required understanding, and she had paid for that understanding with a night she would not forget in any of the years remaining to her. She ate a careful ration, drank a careful mouthful from the canteen, and slept with the mule's flank against her side. On the second morning, the cold that had followed the blizzard into the territory did her a service she had not anticipated. The loose snow had hardened overnight into a crust under the sustained pressure of the post-storm freeze, and when she stepped out of the snow shelter before first light and put her full weight on the surface it held, she walked on top of it with only the topmost inch crunching under her boots, and the difference in her pace was immediate and dramatic. The 8 miles of the first day became 15 on the second, and she covered as much again on the third, navigating by the sun with the patience her father had drilled into her, checking her heading each hour against the sun's arc, adjusting by the smallest increments, when the angle of her shadow suggested she had begun to drift. She talked to the mule as she walked, not because it understood, but because the sound of a human voice in that particular silence was a tether. She needed a thread connecting her to the world of the living that the white emptiness was continuously trying to suggest did not exist. She told it about Lars, about the homestead near Buffalo she had never seen but knew from years of letters. She told it about their father and the boats he had built, the names of those boats, the long Norwegian syllables she had learned on a workbench as a girl. She told it about Thomas, the whole of it, the parts she had never said aloud to anyone, not to Lars in his letters, not to the trader in Billings, not to herself in any honest accounting. Speaking it to the animal in the open air under a cold blue sky did something different than weeping it out in the sealed dark had done. The dark had broken it open. The open air made it small enough to carry. On the third day, the sun disappeared behind high cloud for 3 hours, and she navigated blind, holding her heading by the faint differential in brightness behind the overcast, and by the light residual wind out of the northwest that she used as a second reference point. She counted her steps and checked her shadow whenever a thinning in the cloud gave her enough contrast to see it. When the sun broke through in the early afternoon, she stopped and measured the angle and found she had drifted no more than half a degree off her intended line. She stood in the white waste and shook not from cold from the release of 3 hours of held fear. Then she walked on. She found the two men on the morning of the fourth day. She had crested a long, low rise that she hoped was the high ground north of Buffalo, and she saw them ahead of her where everything else was white and flat and empty. Two dark forms, and she walked toward them, already knowing in the way she had known what the dead stillness of the air meant on the ridge before the storm, what she would find. They had died standing, or nearly standing. They were leaning against the carcasses of their horses, which had also died frozen upright in the drifts that had built around them during the storm, packed and preserved by the cold of the days since. The wind had plastered snow against the men's bodies from the west, half burying them where they stood, and the sustained cold had done the rest. Their faces were turned south, toward Buffalo, toward the town that had been 11 miles away when the storm caught them in the open, and that had remained 11 miles away for every remaining hour of their lives. Sarah stood before them for a long time. She could not bury them. The ground was iron, and her strength was a finite thing she needed to husband carefully for the miles still ahead. The town was close enough that recovery would be someone else's work. She fixed their position in her memory, precisely noting the landmarks she would describe when she arrived, and she said over them the words of her father's faith that she still remembered the Norwegian words from a church she had attended as a child and left behind with the country when she crossed the ocean. But that came back now with the same completeness as the lesson about the walls, as though they had been waiting in storage for exactly this kind of moment. Then she looked at them for one last moment, these two men who had done the brave and reasonable thing, the thing that felt like fighting the thing that a man with experienced hands and a strong horse does when the sky goes dark, and the only sensible response seems to be speed and forward motion. They had known the country. They had crossed this ground many times. Their experience had given them a confidence that the storm had not honored, and they had paid the full price of that dishonoring. She had been a stranger to the Bozeman Trail, crossing it for the first and only time, carrying no accumulated certainty about what it would or would not allow. She had had only her father's lesson and her own reading of the dead wind and the stone, and perhaps that had been the whole of the difference between her and them, that she had had nothing to trust except the oldest and simplest things she knew, while they had had everything to trust and had trusted it into the ground. She walked south. The smoke was the first sign of the living world, a thin gray thread rising perfectly straight into the windless air far to the south, visible for miles in the clarity that follows a blizzard. She fixed on it with the same absolute attention she had given to everything since the wall of cloud appeared on the horizon 4 days before, and she walked toward it through the long afternoon as the thread thickened into a smudge, and the smudge resolved slowly into the low scattered shapes of buildings set against a fold in the white land. She did not know it was Lars's homestead until she was close enough to see the shape of the barn he had described in his letters, the particular pitch of the roof, and the row of young cottonwoods along the windward side that he had planted the first spring, and written about with the careful hope of a man who was building something to last. When she recognized it, she found she could not quicken her pace. Her body had spent everything it had to spend reaching this place and had nothing left for hurry. She came down the last slope toward the gate at the same slow walk she had held for 4 days, leading the mule carrying the satchel on one shoulder and the Dutch oven in the crook of her other arm, the two things she had not been able to bring herself to abandon. Lars saw her from the yard. He was splitting wood near the barn, and he stopped with the maul in his hands and stood looking at the figure coming down out of the white, as though his eyes were reporting something his mind refused to process. He did not run. He stood rooted in the yard, a big fair-haired man, gone thin and gray-faced in the weeks since she should have arrived, and she understood from his stillness and the particular quality of his expression that he had already done what people do when they have waited long enough past the point of reasonable hope. He had placed her somewhere. He had grieved her and set her down and tried to begin the work of carrying the loss forward into his life. She stopped at the gate. "It is me," she said, the words barely carried across the yard. "Lars, it is me. I am not dead." He crossed the yard, then slowly at first, and then all at once, and he caught her as her legs gave way beneath her, the strength that had carried her 60 miles through a country that had tried to kill her. running out at the precise moment it was no longer needed, the way a thing held under tension releases completely when the tension is removed. He half carried her into the house and set her beside the iron stove and wrapped blankets around her and poured coffee with hands that would not stop shaking, saying her name over and over, as though the repetition might convince him she was real. A rider had come through 2 days before he told her when he could speak, carrying news of the blizzard and what it had done on the Bozeman Trail between the Tongue River and the Powder. At least 3 parties caught in the open, no survivors found. 2 men were confirmed dead, frozen against their horses north of town, and those were only the first the spring melt would give back. He had done the arithmetic. He had known she was on that trail overdue alone. He had known what the arithmetic meant, and he had begun quietly and without telling anyone to accept what it told him. "I had already let you go," he said. His voice did not break. He was their father's son, and their father's sons did not break in the way that the voice can break. But something in his face changed as he said it, something that had been held in a fixed position while he waited and grieved, releasing now the way frozen ground releases in spring, slowly and without drama. "In my heart, Sarah, I had let you go." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry I couldn't send word." "That is not what I am angry about." He looked at her hands, at the split and healing skin of her palms, at the dark places under her eyes. "I am angry at Thomas for leaving you in that position, for the debts and the wagon and the road alone in November." He paused. "I am angry that I was not there." She held the coffee cup between her 2 damaged hands and felt the heat of it move up through her palms. "You couldn't have been there." "No," he agreed, "but I can be angry about it anyway." That was the most Lars had ever said about anything that mattered, and she knew it, and she let it sit between them without adding to it because it was complete as it was. She told him what she had done later that night when the warmth of the stove had worked its way back into her feet, and the food he prepared had replaced some of what the 4 days had taken out of her. She told it plainly without dramatics, the way their father had told stories, as a sequence of observations and decisions rather than as a performance. The dead wind on the ridge, the wall of cloud, the choice to climb down instead of running, the bluffs and the third formation with its 3 walls already standing, the 400 yards of dragging, the grass and the canvas and the blankets and the mule, brought inside for reasons that had nothing to do with sentiment. Lars listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat looking at her, hands folded around the empty coffee cup. And then he asked the question she had known was coming, the question anyone would have asked. "How did you know it would work?" She told him about their father, about the fishing huts on the Lofoten headlands, about the autumn she was 9 and the lesson on the cliff. Lars was quiet for a long while. He had heard those same words from the same man, but he had built his life around them in a different way, the way a person builds around a principle they have never been required to test at the limit. He had built his homestead slowly and completely, sealing each season's gains before the next season's losses could reach them, asking the land only for what the land could honestly give. He had been called unambitious for it by men who admired the kind of reaching Thomas had done, men who were mostly gone, now broken or moved on to the next territory, chasing the next version of the dream. Lars was still here, in a sound house with stock in a sound barn. "You and I were taught the same thing," Sarah said. "You have been doing with your whole life what I did with one night." He looked up from the fire and considered that for a moment. "Perhaps," he said, "but I have done it with 30 years in good timber and no storm above me when I started. You did it in the last hour before the wind arrived with a broken wagon and a mule and whatever the ground gave you." He set down his coffee cup. "I do not know that I could have done what you did. The land has been kind to me. It was not kind to you, and you lived anyway. That is a harder thing than anything I have built." She did not answer because the answer would have been a diminishment of what he had given her, which was the only absolution that had ever mattered. Not forgiveness, which implies wrongdoing, recognition. The recognition from someone who knew the lesson and understood its weight, that she had passed a test he himself had never faced and might not have passed. She thought about Cole Briggs 3 weeks later when Lars came back from town with the news. Cole had made it to Decker's station, both horses running ahead of the storm on the strength of the exact experience and confidence that had always gotten him through before. He arrived with 3 toes on his left foot, destroyed by frostbite, one horse dead in the stable yard, and the knowledge that he had survived by the thinnest possible margin of the method that had always worked and had this once almost not worked. When they met at the general store in Buffalo, Cole looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I heard what you did," he said. "The wagon in the hollow." "Yes, I thought you were a fool on that road." "I know you did." A silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was honest in the way that only silences between people who have both been near death can be honest. He looked down at his left boot where something was missing beneath the leather. 12 years I ran that trail," he said. "Every time the sky went bad, I ran. It always worked." Another pause. "I keep thinking about the fact that the 2 things I believed most about that road were both true right up until the moment one of them wasn't." "That's usually how it goes," Sarah said. He nodded once, the nod of a man who is putting something in order inside himself, and they parted without further ceremony. She understood that he was not a lesser man for what had happened to him. He was a man whose method had met the one storm it was not built for, and he was trying to locate the lesson in that without losing the confidence that had made him competent across 12 years of a dangerous profession. That was not a simple thing to do. She did not envy him the work of it. Nora Fitch she met 2 weeks after arriving when Lars drove them both into town for supplies. Nora had survived the blizzard in a cowshed 8 miles south of where Sarah last saw her, driven inside by pure chance when her horse refused to continue, and the shed's half-open door presented itself as the only available option. She had spent 3 days in the dark with 2 abandoned cattle, keeping herself alive on the hay she could reach and the warmth of the animals against the worst of the cold. When she saw Sarah, she gripped both her hands without speaking for a moment. "You told me," Nora said finally, "about the horse, about the 14 miles. You couldn't have known." "No, but you could, and you told me." She released Sarah's hands. "You tried to keep me with you. You had a son waiting." "I still do." A pause. "He was waiting in a warm house in Buffalo. He would have kept waiting." She looked out the window of the store at the white street. "I made it by accident. You made it on purpose." "I have been thinking about that difference every morning since." Sarah did not tell her the difference was smaller than she thought, that purpose and accident both required the same cold to survive in, and that luck had been part of her own survival in ways she would never fully be able to account for. She did not say it because she understood that Nora was not looking for reassurance. She was looking for the lesson, trying to find its edges, trying to understand what had been available to her that she had not known to reach for. That was useful. That was worth preserving. So Sarah only said what she believed to be true. "My father taught me one thing," she said. "I used it for one night. That is the whole of the difference." The deputy, Walt Archer, came to see her the week after she arrived, a quiet man of 38 who had led the recovery party north of town and found the 2 frozen men in the position she had described with enough precision that they located them in a single morning. He sat at Lars's table with his hat in his hands and told her that her description had been the most accurate piece of navigation he had encountered from someone without instruments in country that had been completely remade by snow. Your father taught you to read the sun, he said. One summer on the water, I was 12. He taught you well. He taught me one thing, she said for the second time that week, but it was the right one. Archer wrote a report. It was not an eloquent report. It was the report of a practical man describing practical facts, but it circulated among the homesteaders and cattlemen in the valley in the way that practical and astonishing things circulate in places where everyone knows what the winter is capable of. It became in the way of such things a story told around stoves, losing details with each retelling and keeping its shape until the shape was all that remained and the shape was enough. Sarah stayed through that winter and into the spring, and the staying healed her in ways that labor alone could not have. The simple daily rhythm of the homestead, the feeding of stock and hauling of water, and mending of harness and watching of weather reassembled something in her that the months since Thomas's death had disassembled. Her feet healed completely. Her hands healed the split skin, closing over and leaving only the slightly thickened texture of skin that has been asked to do more than ordinary skin is asked to do. She woke for weeks from dreams in which the canvas tore and did not close, in which the wind found the gap and poured through, and each time she reached in the dark for the warm flank of the mule and found the cold edge of the cot Lars had made up for her beside the stove, and Lars, who heard her in the nights, never asked about it, only made sure the stove never went cold before dawn. She thought about Thomas across that winter with a different quality of thought than she had been able to manage before the storm. The weeping in the hollow had broken the guilt open. The 4 days of walking had worn it smooth. What remained now was something she could hold without being cut by a sorrow, not for what she had failed to prevent, but for what he had been before the dreaming consumed him, for the man who had told her she was beautiful and clever and worth listening to in the years before he stopped listening to her himself. She held that version of him alongside the version that had smiled and gone down the shaft, and she found that holding both at once, without preferring either, was the only honest way to carry him. When spring came and the trail opened, she did not leave. She had nowhere pressing to be, and Lars had work for two, and the homestead had become across that winter the first ground she had stood on in years that felt stable beneath her feet. She stayed. She worked. She earned her place, and then her place ceased to require earning and simply became hers. The mule lived out its years in Lars's pasture, given the easy retirement of an animal that has earned more than any retirement can repay. Sarah would walk out to it some evenings and stand with her hand on its neck, the two of them sharing the particular silence of creatures that have been through something together that cannot be fully communicated to anyone who was not there. She never sold it and never permitted it to be sold. When it died in a green summer many years later, she buried it herself, which the neighbors found peculiar for a worn-out mule, and which she did not explain because some obligations are not of the kind that explanations improve. It kept me warm was all she said when someone pressed her, when nothing else would. The people who knew her story heard more in those words than their surface meaning. They heard the full night in them, the sealed hollow, and the darkness, and the long hours of the wind, finding nothing. And they understood that she was speaking not only about the animal's warmth, but about the fact of its presence, the breathing, living fact of another creature in the dark, when the alternative to that presence was a solitude of a kind that the human body and the human mind were not built to endure alone. The hollow and the sandstone bluff stood through that winter and the winter after, sealed beneath its drifts, The wagon bed wedged in the rock, the frozen canvas welded to the overhang, the grass packed hard as stone into every seam. In spring, an army surveying party found it and could make no sense of it. They recorded it in their ledger as an abandoned structure of unknown origin and purpose, noted its coordinates in the precise language of their profession, and moved on down the reopened trail without looking back. Over the following years, the country took back what Sarah had borrowed from it. The wagon wood rotted and split under the alternating pressure of freeze and thaw. The canvas disintegrated by degrees. The rope her father had given her, the rope that had cut into her shoulders and held the fourth wall in place against 19 hours of the worst storm of the decade, frayed and returned to the earth it had come from. The grass packed into the seams crumbled to dust. Year by year, the hollow shed every evidence of what had been made of it until the sandstone returned to what it had been for 10,000 years before she arrived, and would be for 10,000 after an empty curve of rock, shaped by patient weather, sheltering nothing indifferent to everything. But the understanding she had carried out of it did not rot and did not disintegrate and did not return to anything simpler than itself. She told the story in later years when the children of the valley were old enough to hear it, and she told it always the same way, insisting on its plainness, refusing the elaboration that other people's retellings had added. She did not want them to hear it as the story of a remarkable woman surviving through exceptional means. The storm does not kill people because they are weak. She would tell them, her voice carrying the same patient certainty her father's voice had carried on the headland above the sea. It kills them because they argue with it. The only people who lived were the ones who stopped arguing and started looking. She lived long in that valley. She watched the territory become a state and the trail become a road, and the country fill in around her with people who had never seen the open plains the way she had seen them, killing and empty and perfectly indifferent to whether anyone lived or died on them. She never quite belonged to the gentler country that grew up over the hard one. She carried the hard country inside her. The dead wind and the bruised sky and the 19 hours of roaring dark carried it the way she carried her father's tools, which she kept until the end of her days, and passed eventually to one of Lars's children with the same words Anders had used when he pressed them into her arms. A person should always own the means of making and mending, she told the child, because the day comes for everyone when what they have is broken and there is no one to fix it but themselves. The tools outlasted her. The story outlasted her. The hollow in the sandstone bluff did not, having long since given back every trace of what she had made of it to the wind and the weather that had shaped it in the first place. But what she had understood in that hollow in the sealed dark with the storm, searching for the opening that was not there, lived on in the people who heard it and in the people who heard it from them, passing through the years and losing its particulars and keeping its shape until it was less, the story of one woman in one storm, and more a way of seeing that was available to anyone willing to stop and use it. The broken pieces are enough if you make them whole. The wall need not be strong. The storm always passes over the one who stops arguing with it and gives it nothing to find.